evening to this, the 6th School of Government International Relations Distinguished Lecture. Tonight's lecture will be delivered by our colleague, Professor AJ Brown, and it's entitled A National Integrity Commission, Options for Australia. But before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd also like to welcome Mr Paul Aylesbury, the Senior Executive Officer Corruption of the Crime and Corruption Commission, Ms Cathy Sawtell, who's member of the Griffith Government International Relations Advisory Board, members and friends from Transparency International Australia, our valued partner, members of the Griffith Government International Relations Student Society, colleagues from Government International Relations School of and the Centre for Governance and Public Policy, graduate and undergraduate students, alumni and friends. We're all gathered here on this cool night to listen to Professor AJ Brown, and he's going to explore the role of a National Integrity Commission. Professor Brown comes to this lecture with a wealth of expertise in this area at his command. He's the leader at the Centre of Governance and Public Policy's Public Integrity and Anti-Corruption Research Program and Program Director of the new Graduate Certificate in Integrity and Anti-Corruption at Griffith. He has led 6 Australian Research Council projects into public integrity and governance reform since 2005, including 3 into public interest whistleblowing. A 25-year veteran of developments in Australia's integrity systems, since 2010 he's been a board member of Transparency International Australia, and in October 2017 was elected to the global board of the World Anti-Corruption Organisation. In 2012, his biography, Michael Kirby, Paradoxes and Principles, was shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Literary Award, the Walkley Book Award and National Biography Award. He is the 2017-18, just immediately past president of the Australian Political Studies Association, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law, member of the Commonwealth Government's Expert Advisory Panel on Whistleblowing Protection, and project leader of Australia's 2nd National Integrity System Assessment. This year's Distinguished Lecture will present a new picture of the options for the Commonwealth Government to undertake its long overdue strengthening of public integrity systems. As you probably know, every Australian state and both territories have or will still have a broad-based independent integrity or anti-corruption commission, but the Commonwealth Government does not. This evening, Professor Brown will draw on initial results from Australia's 2nd National Integrity System Assessment, the Griffith University-led ARC linkage project to explore a National Integrity Commission of options for Australia. Now, because this lecture is being recorded for ABC Radio National's Big Ideas program and live streamed on our very own YouTube channel, if you could please avoid embarrassment and turn off your phones, I'd much appreciate it. We all would. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to AJ, and following that we're going to have a Q&A session. So, mic off and over to you. Thanks, AJ.
Robin, and thank you very much, colleagues, friends, allies, for joining us for this year's Distinguished Lecture and for a discussion that I think will demonstrate to you not only just how significant and important systemic reform of our integrity institutions is in Australia, but how closely it links to the events that are unfolding in Canberra as we speak over these days and weeks, which cast a whole new light on our trajectory as a nation in terms of the quality of democracy and trust and confidence in our institutions. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment as it links directly to all of our research that we're currently having the privilege to lead into the strengths and weaknesses in our integrity systems. But I did want to open by saying what a wonderful time to be a student and an observer of politics. Having just come from Canberra, a few very interesting days in Canberra, it's certainly the right time to be thinking about trust and confidence in our institutions, what contributes to it, what erodes it, and what we can do about our institutional frameworks that will actually increase our chances of growing it and recovering it and sustaining it. What I wanted to do today was to share with you the newly released set of options for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission or a National Integrity Commission or a federal anti-corruption body or what's sometimes called a federal ICAC, Independent Commission Against Corruption, in order to give you some insights into the range of options that we actually have as a country for how we might strengthen our integrity systems, particularly in relation to our federal level of government. As you'll see, as I speak to you for the next 30 or 40 minutes, you'll see that those things that I just mentioned, Federal ICAC, Integrity Commission, these different ideas, these different notions, these different models are not one and the same. They actually connote quite different things, and the differences between them and the availability of these different options and the question of the quality of what's pursued by future federal governments is actually vitally important to where we go next in a very practical political sense, and I'll explain why. What I'll do is I'll do four things. I'll set the scene a little bit for why this is such an important issue and such a relevant issue to what's happening in the country at the moment. I'll share with you the results from our National Integrity System assessment in order to give you some sense of our appraisal of the strengths and the weaknesses, and particularly the weaknesses in our federal integrity system, not just right at the moment, but over many years. Then I'll run you through what we've articulated as being a new set of options or a different way of looking at the options for what kind of reform should occur. And then in conclusion, I'll come back to the current day and to how we might think about both the chances of this type of reform happening, especially as events change and unfold in Canberra, but also how we should think about it, how we should assess that viability, and how we should actually be both positive and quite insistent, I think, about the importance of these reforms. So let me just start by setting a bit of the context, setting a bit of the scene for where Australia stands in the world and how we're actually perceived these days when it comes to the quality of our government from the point of view of integrity and corruption risks. As Robin mentioned, I have the great honour to be involved very closely not only with Transparency International Australia, the country's only national non-government organisation fighting corruption, but also on the global board of the organisation. So we get to see a big landscape of corruption and corruption risks and corruption responses from all around the world that can inform our assessment of how is Australia travelling, where do we stand. And as you can see from the results from the last 5 years of Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, we've traditionally had a position of strength as a very high quality governance nation by international standards and a very low corruption nation in terms of the public sector by international standards. But we can see that in just 5 years it's possible to slip quite dramatically out of the top 10 countries of the world into the second tier, into the next comparing overall global trends in terms of how countries are positioned and how they're travelling in terms of their fight against corruption. What I think is even more useful is to focus on some data that we've just released very recently, just this week. If you read The Australian recently, then you would have seen the release of some of the first output from this major research program that we're undertaking at the moment, which is a special global corruption barometer survey conducted between Griffith University and our partners and Transparency International Australia. And in combination with the research that we've been doing over about a decade here at Griffith, looking at constitutional values of Australians, in combination with our constitutional values survey results, we can see just how dramatic and distinct the impact of people's concerns about trust and confidence in government has been. We often talk about this as being a global trend, that governments everywhere are under pressure, governments everywhere are suffering collapses in trust and confidence in institutions. In fact, it's important not to overgeneralise that, because when you look at the fine detail of the research on trust and confidence in government around the world, it's not just a one-way trip and it's not uniform. It's highly dependent on what's going on in individual countries. It's not swamped by Donald Trump. It's actually a reflection of the fact that citizens form their views about the level of trust and confidence they can have in their national institutions based on their national institutions and their own quality of life and the responsiveness of government in their own jurisdictions. But what we now know is that the collapse in trust and confidence in our federal level of government since 2008, which, as of the research that we've conducted in May and June this year, has continued, is a really distinct and important trend for Australia, because when you look at it compared with trust and confidence in our state level of government and our local level of government, then we can see that our faith and confidence in our whole system of democracy has for many, many years hung on the trust and confidence that we put in democracy, service delivery, public administration at the federal level. And the collapse of that has really literally left citizens with nowhere to go in terms of having a level of government in which they have higher levels of trust and confidence. I think that we can probably fairly safely predict, and I'll come back to this through the course of this discussion and at the end, I think we can fairly safely predict that the next time this survey is conducted, trust and confidence in the federal level won't be any higher than it was in May and June when it was recorded by our latest global corruption survey, which for the first time really very clearly has trust and confidence in the federal level down at the 46% mark for the first time. But I want to ask you to reflect on trust and confidence and what it means, because one of the very interesting challenges of this kind of research and this kind of debate is to say, well, what is trust and confidence? And increasingly, there's a recognition that we need to differentiate between the different types of trust and confidence that people have in their institutions and in governments. It's very easy for people who are concerned about corruption and integrity to say that trust and confidence is all about trust in terms of honesty and integrity. They can't be trusted because they lie, because they're corrupt, because they're in it for themselves, etc. But in fact, if you look at the question that we ask in the Constitutional Values Survey and the Global Corruption Barometer Survey, it's a different concept. The concept is, how well is a government doing at its particular job? It's actually a question of competence, not just honesty and integrity. And the other thing that we know feeds into calculations of trust and confidence in government is not just competence, not just honesty and integrity, but simple reliability. We know that people have a high level of trust and confidence in some governments around the world, even though their competence is quite dubious by OECD standards, and even when they're known to be quite corrupt, that at least they're reliably corrupt. And people know how the system works, and so people know how to fulfil their lives and get what they can out of the system, and at least it's stable and reliable. And that could be a factor that explains why trust and confidence remains high in average in relation to the local government level, even when there are big corruption scandals running in the country. And I think that's probably something an accurate description of a little bit of what's happening now as well. So what's, I think, important about the latest global corruption barometer research that we've been doing is that it actually lets us look at the relationship between these things for the first time, so that we can say, in the middle of all this political turmoil, including our own political turmoil, including our crises of political party leadership and crises of confidence in the federal parliament, which may or may not be sitting at any given time, depending on what might be happening in terms of those crises of confidence and leadership. We can actually, for the first time, say that in terms of Australians' calculation of trust and confidence in government, that the extent to which they believe that politicians, in particular public servants as well, are corrupt, factors in at perhaps between 20 to 31% of the variation in trust and confidence when measured in terms of this competence concept. So we can actually say that the variation in trust and confidence in the broad and in terms of this measure of the competence of governments is being significantly influenced, or at least has a significant relationship, a very substantial relationship with people's judgments in relation to perceptions that their policymakers and their leaders are corrupt, and plays a very, very important role in overall trust and confidence, even though the things are not the one and the same. And I'll come back to that in my closing remarks. What we also know is not only that perceptions of corruption and the level of corruption account for something like 20 to 31% of people's assessments of trust and confidence, but we also know the reverse is true, that when governments are perceived as handling the fight against corruption well, then it factors into positive trust and confidence. And in fact, it factors in even more strongly. Interestingly, and perhaps consistently with the difference between the state and federal levels in terms of trust and confidence, we actually know that the question of the significance of the fight against corruption and whether it's being handled well or badly factors in more strongly for people's calculations of trust and confidence in the federal level than it does for the state level. So about 25% of people's assessment as to whether they have trust and confidence in the state level is associated with their perception of whether the government is doing a good job fighting corruption or not. But that goes up to 37% for the association with the federal level of government. And so we can see that what the federal government does, what the federal parliament does, is actually vitally important to the health of our democracy overall, not just in terms of competence, not just in terms of reliability, which is certainly a little bit absent at the moment, but in terms of trust and confidence as defined by integrity, honesty and freedom from corruption. Now, as part of the background, let me just explain to you that what I'll give you today in terms of some analysis of our federal integrity system and the options for reforming it are based on a large second integrity system assessment of Australia, which we're very privileged to lead at Griffith in partnership with other universities, in partnership with the University of Sunshine Coast, with Flinders University, and also with a number of partners, including Transparency International Australia, but also the Crime and Corruption Commission here in Queensland, the Tasmanian Integrity Commission, Queensland's Integrity Commissioner, and the New South Wales Ombudsman's Office. And so we're very lucky to have that support, as well as the support of the Australian Research Council in pursuing an assessment of this kind. It's based on a long-term vision in Transparency International of the need to look at our systems of integrity and accountability as systems rather than simply looking for quick fix solutions to a corruption crisis or scandal at any particular time. And this is the concept of the National Integrity System. And I'm very proud to say that Griffith University has been associated with and helped in some ways inspire the whole concept of the National Integrity System over 20 years ago in Transparency, or around 20 years ago in Transparency International, through the work of many people, including our colleague Professor Charles Samford in the Griffith Law School and the former Key Centre for Ethics, Law, Justice and Governance. Since that time, it's become a mainstay of the way in which Transparency International helps countries, helps governments, helps stakeholders assess or attempt to assess holistically how their systems of government can be, governance can be strengthened to help ensure against corruption and how to maximise integrity. I won't go into the details of the famous Transparency International grid temple model of the national integrity system or some of the alternative concepts that there are, but it provides a framework for saying that it's possible and necessary to take a holistic approach looking across a whole range of institutions, processes and functions, and very happy to take endless questions about the framework and its history and its methodology. What I did want to emphasise that it's part of I guess a much wider field of research in political science, which has been documenting the different forms of accountability that work in modern societies, in newer democracies, in democracies in transition, in more established democracies, in non-democracies, to actually identify the different forms of accountability that work to sustain or pursue integrity and to constrain corruption. And the beauty, I think, of the national integrity system approach is that it lets us look at a number of these different forms of accountability. Vertical accountability associated with the ability of the people to elect parliamentarians who elect or determine the government, who then supervises the executive and the public administration, is vertical accountability. And what we're talking about here is to a large degree, the kind of horizontal accountability that traditionally was served by the separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and particularly the judiciary and the role of independent courts, but increasingly diversified to include a whole range of integrity institutions and mechanisms which are independent of the executive and which have a status of their own as exercising important controls and influence over, especially how the executive in democracies behave. But part of all of this matrix is also social accountability and the role that civil society, the general community and the media play continually, both to make those mechanisms work and to act as direct influences on the way in which our institutions and our power holders perform. And so this is actually a very good opportunity to also mark and celebrate the work of actually 4 important colleagues of mine at the School of Government and International Relations and the Centre for Governance and Public Policy, one of whom, 3 of whom have submitted their doctoral theses all in the last 2 weeks or a few weeks before. So the future expert on social accountability and its interaction with anti-corruption mechanisms and horizontal accountability is the soon-to-be Dr. Samuel Ankamar, who's in the audience tonight, and whose scholarship I've benefited from, and who I'm proud to call a colleague in this research as well. Ahmed Abdulami, who submitted his doctoral thesis this week looking at the powers of constitutional courts, particularly to constrain wayward legislatures. And you might think we may not need to do that in Australia, but when things happen like happen today, when parliaments don't even sit when they're meant to, you start to wonder, well, maybe it would be good if a constitutional court might actually say, well, you have to, if necessary. If this was to continue for too long of not sitting, then who would actually eventually say, well, I'm afraid you are actually obliged to sit? And a third colleague who has been a fundamental part of this public attitude research on trust and confidence, the soon-to-be Dr. Jacob Deem, who submitted his PhD thesis not very long ago, and also one of our most important research managers, Dr. Marissa Dozo, who's responsible for many of the correlations tonight that I'm reeling off at you, who's also been a fundamental part of this research. And I just wanted to acknowledge them and mention them because, as you can see, this type of research is not simple. It is complex. It canvasses a big spectrum, and fortunately, it's supported by a lot of people, including our excellent doctoral scholars here at the Griffith School of Government and International Relations. So I might just ask you to, in fact, congratulate especially all 4 of those, but especially all 3 of those doctoral students who have just all submitted literally in the last few weeks. So to get back to the story to which they are all contributing, this question of anti-corruption bodies and their role in these processes of accountability and these systems is one that is of growing responsibilities, the risks they pose, but also how those risks can be managed as an important part of our institutional landscape. And this issue is a huge issue for Australia now, perhaps even more so given the current and recent events at a federal government level in our politics. The debate about a federal anti-corruption body or National Integrity Commission has been around for years. It was the first National Integrity System assessment run between Griffith University and Transparency International Australia in 2005 that first recommended that there should be such a body with a broad jurisdiction and a broad scope. But late last year, a Senate Select Committee on a National Integrity Commission reported and recommended that the idea needed to be given serious consideration, which was a big step forward from the previous denial of the potential for such a reform amongst all the major political parties. In December, the Prime Minister, as he was then, Malcolm Turnbull, indicated that the government was open to the idea, and at the end of January, the Labor opposition committed to introduce some kind of National Integrity Commission when it's next in office. So the debate is on, and really the debate now is not just whether this will happen, but what will happen. What will be the quality of this reform? Will it actually be something which strengthens our system, or will it be, dare we fear such a thing, a piece of window dressing or an institution that is some way set up to not quite do everything that everybody wants it to do because it's too much of a challenge to particular parts of our systems of government. And so hence we come to the options that are on the table this week, which we've released in the new options paper for our integrity system assessment, a National Integrity Commission Options for Australia. Copies of this paper are available. You only need to go to the Transparency International Australia website or to the Griffith University website. You just need to put Griffith University and anti-corruption into your favourite web browser and you will find it. And I'm not going to labour you through all the detail of our assessment, but I do encourage you to have a look and pick up a copy of it, and to understand why it's very important for people to be now engaged, not just in whether this happens, but exactly what happens. And the reason is that the Commonwealth Government does have an integrity system. It does have what's been called for many years a multi-agency approach. One of the challenges for the federal government has been to come around to an understanding that in fact every functioning system of government has a multi-agency approach as part of its integrity system and the interaction of different institutions and processes for integrity. So the Commonwealth Government has never been unique in having a multi-agency approach. The question is, how well is that multi-agency approach working, and where are the gaps and where are the strengths and weaknesses? So in this analysis, through a whole range of research, a lot of interviews, a lot of desktop research, and a lot of inside knowledge of the system, we're asking a number of questions about how effective and how comprehensive this current multi-agency approach really is. And so in the analysis you'll find we've identified 7 strategic weaknesses. And for the first time, we believe this gives us a clearer roadmap to exactly what type of reform is needed to do the job, which should then inform the design of institutions, rather than just assuming that a particular institution off the shelf from somewhere else will actually automatically provide the answer. I won't labour through all of these, but I want to give you a touch of 4 of these different weaknesses in particular to give you a sense of why the options that we're putting on the table now as a result of this research are somewhat broader, and I think some require somewhat more consideration from whoever is the government or forms the next government as to exactly what type of reform will pass muster when it comes to actually doing the job that is needed to be done. So you might call this evidence-based policy or evidence-based institutional design, and that's deliberate because the whole idea is to not simply fall prey to the trends that many very high corruption risk countries pursue, which is to fall into some kind of symbolic exercise or adopt one type of symbolic institutional reform. So just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of what we've found in the course of the assessment so far, you'll see that one of those weaknesses was the low and uncertain level of resourcing of the existing integrity framework at a federal government level. And when we compare not necessarily the amount of money that's being put into anti-corruption agencies or anti-corruption investigation bodies individually, but if you actually do a slightly more holistic job and actually compare the amount of resources that are going into the group of core integrity agencies, Ombudsman's offices, Auditor General, anti-corruption, that form the core of the independent investment, or the investment in independent institutions that make up the core of our integrity frameworks, then the Commonwealth Government compares particularly badly, not just to the states, but on an international level. The weakness of the investment in this at the federal government level in Australia pulls down Australia's average compared to countries that we might like to compare ourselves against. So when you look and see, you can see not only is the Commonwealth Government doing a lot less than the states, but on average Australia is doing a lot less than, say, a country like New Zealand, when you look at the resources as a proportion of overall public expenditure, either at a jurisdictional level or a national level. And I think that's pretty significant for Australia, because we understand New Zealand for a start, and New Zealand is actually number one on the Transparency International Corruptions Perceptions Index. It hasn't been slipping and has been responding to opportunities for reform, and is maintaining a comparatively high investment at the princely sum of 0.111%. So that's like, just over 1/10 of 1% of total public expenditure going into those types of agencies. So it's not really expensive when you think about it. So that, and I'll come back to that very quickly at the end. The second strategic major weakness at the federal government level is the lack of coordinated oversight of not just purely corrupt conduct that might be identified as criminal, and that's lacking as well, but the lack of oversight across the whole jurisdiction of public servants, of politicians, in relation to what you might call high-risk misconduct, grey area corruption, undue influence, acting in the presence of undisclosed conflicts of interest, all the types of behaviour that any human being can easily fall prey to, which is the slippery slope towards creating an environment where corruption takes hold, or blacker forms of corruption take hold. And so one of the clear rationales for institutional reform is not just that we should spend more money on it, but that in fact there is a highly fragmented system at our Commonwealth Government level compared to all of the states in Australia now, in terms of who is actually subject to any kind of independent oversight or insurance should integrity risks, should high-risk misconduct matters actually arise and occur. At a Commonwealth Government level, we simply do not know what is really going on across the vast proportion of the public service when it comes to high-risk misconduct and how it's being dealt with, even if it is identified somewhere in an agency or in a government department or in defence or etc. And so in the paper we actually go a step further than that and look at some of the highest risk areas like procurement at a Commonwealth level, like the fact that the Department of Defence spends $32.7 billion a year on procurement, and the fact that although there are mechanisms in defence and although there are mechanisms across the Commonwealth for trying to make sure that procurement is high quality, there is no independent oversight and insurance from an integrity body or an anti-corruption body who could independently investigate high-risk misconduct, which doesn't involve clear, compelling evidence of criminal offences, in order to be able to actually monitor how the corruption risks in the procurement field are actually panning out. The third issue that I wanted to highlight, which is a strategic weakness, is the fragmented state of the system, not just from the point of view of its coverage, but from the point of view of those who need to be using it. And that means not only the public, that means not only business, that means especially whistleblowers in the public sector and the private sector. And the gaps are quite clear. The reforms that were achieved in the introduction of a federal public sector whistleblower protection scheme in 2013 aren't working, and that's been quite clearly documented, and it's quite clearly explained by the lack of an independent whistleblower protection agency or authority who can actually make those systems work. And the same we know is now true of the private sector as well. And so I have the honour of giving some advice to the federal government in my capacity as a member of the Commonwealth Government's Ministerial Expert Advisory Panel on Whistleblower Protection, and have been part of the discussions that will start to lead to some legislative reform on that in the very near term, we hope, which will be of high quality, we hope, but it's only the first step towards establishing a proper whistleblower protection agency or authority as recommended by other parliamentary committees over some time. And then finally, we have the integrity risks confronting our politicians in particular, and the perceptions of the level of integrity and of corruption amongst federal elected representatives has been imploding in the last few years and in the last 2 years, and obviously relates directly to this continuing collapse of trust and confidence that is being recorded more generally. So the proportion of Australians who believe that some or most or all federal politicians are corrupt rose from 76% in 2016 now to 85% just 2 years later, with all the shift happening from those who believe that some are corrupt to believing that most are corrupt. And we can think about the individual scandals, we can think about former Speaker Bronwyn Bishop and her helicopters, we can think about former Minister Susan Ley and her taxpayer-funded travel for real estate acquisition purposes. We can think about former Member of Parliament Bruce Bilson accepting employment with his next employer while still sitting in the House of Representatives in breach of the Statement of Ministerial Standards. We can think of individuals, and it all plays into a general feeling of concern about the level of corruption amongst, or corruption risk amongst our federal politicians. So hence the options that are there in the paper for you to think about. And in very brief terms, I just want to emphasise that we have a very clear choice between what the federal government has traditionally been looking at over the last few years, which is a bit better coordination of the parts of the existing system. And so we have an option, which is an Integrity and Anti-Corruption Coordination Council that actually costs out what might do that job if we thought that was all the job that was needed. The paper and the analysis makes pretty clear that, in fact, more than that is needed. But that's what it would look like if that's all we wanted to do. The second option in the analysis is actually the federal ICAC, to take the best experience of an anti-corruption body from the states and to create a federal one that is basically a public sector anti-corruption commission and has the right powers and the same mechanics to be able to do the same sort of job as the Crime and Corruption Commission here in Queensland or the Independent Commission Against Corruption in New South Wales, etc. And there's been a lot of pressure for the idea that really what the Commonwealth Government needs is an ICAC like in New South Wales. And so that's fleshed out and that's costed and that's analysed and there's some idea about the extent to which that would address the types of weaknesses we're talking about. But the third option that the paper maps out is actually an institutional design that would address those weaknesses that I've just been talking about. It would do the anti-corruption job of a state-style anti-corruption commission, but it would actually not just do that job, because it would do a number of jobs, both that are only needed at a Commonwealth Government level in terms of its role in our national and international anti-corruption effort across the public and private sectors, and dealing with other countries and our responsibilities to other countries when it comes to proceeds of corruption that end up here in Australia. A whole range of factors that go with the Commonwealth Government's particular responsibilities when it comes to integrity and anti-corruption more generally. But in particular, it would address these other big gaps in terms of what would a strong parliamentary standards and integrity regime look like to actually lead the country back away from this collapsing picture of trust. What would be required to actually have a proper national whistleblower protection authority to cover private and public sector whistleblowers, which is not a responsibility that the states have or need to have in the same way that the federal government needs to take it on. So there are a number of things, and I could expand upon them, that we think when you look at the analysis, it actually makes sense to consider a third option, which is better than the classic federal ICAC type of model. And so we've laid that out for people's consideration. Interestingly, just so that you think, well, that sounds pie in the sky, doing the Rolls-Royce model, surely that's unrealistic. In fact, if we spent all of that money that we've costed out in the options, then it would still only get us up to about 0.096% of total public expenditure, even for the Rolls-Royce model. And I can assure you that we, in that particular costing, we threw in all the bells and whistles to see whether we would need to get close to New Zealand. And you can still say that, well, we'd still be saving money on New Zealand as a proportion of our total public expenditure to pursue a well-developed option of that larger kind. So in conclusion, I really want to bring us back to the here and now and to think about, well, what's politically possible? You can see what's financially possible, but what's politically possible and what should be the political approach that we take to the feasibility of these reforms. One of the things we've asked for the first time is, or for the first time in this manner, is how much public support is out there. And there is strong public support even when you put it under pressure and say to people, well, some people say it's not needed because the federal police and all these other agencies can do the job. And the response to that is, from many people is, oh, well, if you say so, then okay, we believe it. But from many other people is not to be deterred from the strength of their support for the idea of a reform of some kind. And what was perhaps most interesting is that amongst the 245 respondents in our national survey who had ever worked for federal government, they had the highest proportion of strong support for the idea, even though they in fact overall did not believe that corruption was as big a problem as the average citizen and the rest of the sample. And there's a lesson in that, I think, which is the lesson for how we should conceive these reforms and where we should go from here. Which is that we don't need to see them in terms of a crisis. I think we can see some of what's happening politically at the moment in terms of a crisis, but the question is whether that's necessary in order to decide that we need to make a significant step and pursue a significant reform of this kind. We can look at the current and recent events as experts in political science and say, well, our political system will survive. We know that there will be elections, we know that governments will reform, we know the system will continue to work, we know the public service will continue to work, and so we can afford to look at what's happening with some of the turmoil at a federal political level and the causes and the prompts for this continuing collapse in trust in a slightly academic way, because we can be positive that the system will survive in some way, shape or form and bounce back. But I think we have to recognise that the average citizen is increasingly looking at this not through that sort of lens and is increasingly saying, well, we didn't think it could get any worse, but it just has. And can actually end up, that we can end up at a point where the collapse in trust and confidence turns us into a system of government and a society which is different from that which we've traditionally been and that which we want to be. So we can't do much about the reliability dimension of trust and confidence. That's pretty clear at the moment. In terms of stability and reliability, from an integrity reform point of view, we can't fix that. We can't fix the implosion of leadership challenges and competition and the removal of sitting prime ministers, which seems to be our revolving door policy for the last few years. We can't fix the competence dimension of trust and confidence. We can't make governments more competent just by pursuing integrity reforms. But we can do something about the honesty and integrity component of the trust and confidence equation that citizens enter into. So we know that we can do a lot to do something about trust and confidence and its decline in this country by actually looking at significant, serious, systemic reforms to support the integrity and accountability of our political institutions at a federal level. And so I'm hoping that with the benefit of these options and with your support and the support of everybody who cares about the state of the federal integrity system and the state of democracy nationally, that we'll be in a position over the next 2 or 3 years to actually see some sort of reform to deal with that part of the dimension of the trust and confidence crisis. And the question is not whether, but the question is what is done, whether it's strong enough and credible enough to help address all of those particular risks and threats. So thank you very much.
I am getting my microphone ready. I'd like to thank AJ and to say, I think in the course of your talk, my trust and confidence on the basis of the data you presented has gone down a notch or two. But we'd like to open the floor now for questions. Tracy's got a roving mic or two so that we can hear you. And there's a question up the back.
Thanks for that, AJ. Actually, Robin indicated the question I had, and it might seem like a cheeky question, but I wonder about tying whistleblowing and government integrity and lack of corruption so closely to trust and confidence, because I wonder if the better your integrity mechanisms are, the more publicity that the corruption that there is the more publicity will be brought to it, and the more that will make trust go down. You know, sort of like when the reporting mechanisms get much better for certain types of crimes, all of a sudden there's an explosion in crime. Is it the case that we want to tie it so closly to trust and say that when we strengthen the whistleblowing, the trust will go up?
Sure. When we're talking about whistleblowing here, we're not talking about public whistleblowing. We're not talking about just public whistleblowing. We're actually talking about whistleblowing as a process, as a three-tier process, in fact, of internal and regulatory and then public whistleblowing, typically as a last resort. So the gap in the system here is that there's no effective systems and institutional arrangements to support the proper protection of whistleblowers, even if they're just blowing the whistle internally or at a regulatory level, going to regulators, doing what good public servants or good citizens or good employees should do. So that might help answer some of the question. It's specifically not about necessarily hanging it all out to dry. It's actually about having systems within our institutions that actually deal with integrity as an internal process. And that cuts across many other dimensions of what's needed as well. But the other significant thing is that the assumption that when corruption is publicised, it causes a decrease in trust is in fact, I increasingly believe, based on our research, a false assumption. What we can see from some of this data is the very clear correlation between people's trust and confidence and their belief that the government is doing the right job, but also, and this is what we're looking into now, people's awareness of corruption and the performance of particular anti-corruption agencies. And I've worked, having done a lot of research with whistleblowers and on whistleblowing for a long time, I became quite persuaded when I started to see the extent to which people believe that the best way of getting wrongdoing addressed is by not going public, but by going to institutions who can do something about it, and that's true of whistleblowers as well, not just of the average citizen. And I think when you put it all together, what you can see is that most people are pretty sensible. Most people suspect that people who are in power or public office or whatever are probably in it to themselves at least some of the time, in it for themselves at least some of the time. It's just human nature. The question is whether there's any confidence about whether that'll be picked up and stopped if it becomes a problem, before it becomes too much of a problem. And perhaps this is a uniquely Australian thing, uniquely pragmatic and laconic and lazy. But I genuinely believe that one of the reasons why people have confidence in these independent institutions is because, they see the corrupt, there's a blow-up, there's an inquiry, there's corruption on the front page, etc. But they also see at the same time that it's being identified and dealt with. And so they go, good, okay, well, we knew they were probably all corrupt, but it's being dealt with. And I think that's an important part of what sustains trust and confidence in the whole system. And we could go into some of the literature in the background and follow scholars who have talked about the institutionalisation of distrust. I'm channeling John Braithwaite here. The institutionalisation of distrust as a means of enculturating trust. And so I think it's more complex than simply saying because it's publicised, people will believe that there's more corruption. I think most people believe that there could be lots of corruption anyway. The question is whether it's being identified and dealt with. The other thing about it is whether it's being identified and dealt with quickly and independently by someone in whom people can have confidence. And this is the great challenge for whoever is Prime Minister today or next week or whatever, is that they've got no mechanism when these things pop up amongst politicians and amongst ministers. They've got no mechanism for being able to deal with it with some level of independent assurance and quickly. It's always a question of, well, who's going to investigate this? I'm the Prime Minister, I'm going to ring the head of my department who's going to have a bit of a look at it for me under the Statement of Ministerial Conduct and then tell me something. And then I'm going to do something. But there's no greater process or clarity than that. And so I think we have to sort of rethink some of those assumptions about how these systems work, but also about how the community thinks about corruption and power in our institutions.
Yes, please.
One of the challenges of international anti-corruption agencies globally and also in some of our states has been political interference when they're perceived to become too effective. Do you address in the paper any mechanisms by which the National Integrity Commission could defend itself against that type of challenge?
Well, I think we know many of the answers to that in terms of the type of independence that they need to be given and the type of resources. And it requires leadership within those agencies. We know that there's good precedence within Australia for, and indeed here in Queensland, for having strong mechanisms, for appointing commissioners within whom the Parliament will have confidence and all sides of politics will have confidence, are stronger for the heads of our anti-corruption agencies, and especially here in Queensland indeed, than they are for our judiciary and our Chief Justices. So that helps create a political environment that says, yes, we will trust this person, and makes it harder for people to turn into a part of our political fight if they don't like what this person or this agency is saying. So there are a range of technical mechanisms like that. I think it makes us actually take a step back and think about what is the position of these agencies in our system and look at the history of how long it took us to have independent courts that were supported by cultures and institutions. Even in some very high corruption-prone countries, you will still find that there is an independent judiciary that's sort of holding the place together. Papua New Guinea sort of springs to mind. And so we should think about the history of what has it taken us to develop that sort of tradition and those sorts of, and it's not just, you can't just do it in law, it's culture, and it's institutional culture as well as popular culture and popular support and recognition of the roles of those bodies. And I guess that would be the other dimension when you look at it internationally. You see people have been out on the streets in Poland defending an independent judiciary. They've been out on the streets in Indonesia and in many other countries defending an independent anti-corruption body. And so I think there are a range of things, and it's why the sort of work that Samuel does on social accountability and the interactions is so important. It's not just a legal fix, it's not just a technical fix, it actually requires the community to be involved and vigilant and supportive of these arrangements as well. But I think we see that when those ingredients all line up, then I think we see success. And that's internationally, I think that's increasingly what the TI, the Transparency International experience is telling us.
In 2017, I attended the National Integrity Conference and I raised an issue when we were having an open discussion about whistleblower protections. And it was an idea about evolving the superannuation insurances to involve a whistleblower protection insurance, so that all workers could actually become guardians of their workplaces with no fear of not being able to meet legal fees, and without feeling that they would suffer financially, because they would know themselves from their own choice of policies that whether they were covered or not. It would allow them to be more self-determining when they came forward, etc., etc. And I also sort of felt that the workplace would respond knowing that the workers' power was starting to be balanced back in a positive way. So I came here tonight because I was very interested to know, because you were one of the people that was quite positive on that, whether there's been any more discussion on the topic, and can it go any further, and would it help to close the gap between compliance, work health safety type issues and the high end of the drama of corruption?
And I'm happy to say that there has been a lot more discussion on that whole issue. It really plays out in two ways. And since that time, since March last year when we held a conference, since that time, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services, the Federal Parliamentary Committee, completed its inquiry in September, in parallel to this inquiry into a Senate Select Committee on a National Integrity Commission. Completed its inquiry and reported in September, and then so it's subsequent to that the Commonwealth Government deliberations, including the panel that I'm a member of, were constituted to keep on looking at these things. And it's a very significant report. The Parliamentary Joint Committee recommended two things that I think are critical. One is that some of the advances in some of the other Commonwealth legislation that recognises that whistleblowing is simply should be part of organisational life and should be supported as such, were recognised in terms of the principle that it shouldn't be just simply when you're subjected to direct retaliation that you're able to achieve compensation for having blown the whistle, for example. It should be that if you're collateral damage, it should be that every organisation recognises they have a duty to support and protect people who speak up about wrongdoing, and if there's a failure to fulfil that duty and there's any injustice that's caused to somebody, then they should be able to seek compensation and redress. And so very much like workplace health and safety, like a no-fault regime, in effect, as a principle. That was the recommendation as part of this, and that's what's playing out currently in terms of law reform amendments to the Corporations Act, which have been already introduced in the Parliament and which are the subject of proposals for amendment right now. And you might well see in the next few weeks the outcome of that, whether that principle will actually flow through or not. I can't say whether it will or it won't. Obviously, I think it should, and the main thing is that it can. And that's just within the next few weeks. So that's a good one to watch, to see how that unfolds. The other is the idea of a reward scheme for whistleblowers, sometimes in other countries called a bounty scheme, which is the idea that when somebody blows the whistle on wrongdoing, that they should be able to recover a percentage of the penalty that's imposed on the wrongdoers or the fraud that's recovered, that a percentage go to the whistleblower. And in the US tradition, obviously, that really means that the lion's share of the percentage goes to the lawyers who are acting on behalf of the whistleblower, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a self-feeding, self-sustaining regime with some downsides as well as some very big upsides. And the main thing is that the Parliamentary Joint Committee recommended very clearly in favour of establishing a reward scheme for Australia that would cover private sector and public sector, not necessarily or not a direct copy of a US type model, but a a recognition of that the value of what whistleblowers are disclosing should be ploughed back into whistleblower support and protection, and possibly the funding of a proper whistleblower protection authority to provide all the support to the whistleblowers who aren't in a position to take advantage of that type of reward scheme because of the nature of what they've disclosed and whether there is or isn't a penalty and pecuniary return, blah, 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 blah. So that is another angle on the same issue of basically institutionalising the recognition of the value of what people are doing as part of their duty in their organisational life, and actually making sure that gets ploughed back into support for whistleblowers. So that's on the table as well. A government response to all of that Parliamentary Joint Committee's recommendations is now overdue. It's going to have to come because they're going to have to respond to all of these issues. And it's an issue on which I think both sides of politics won't be able to run away from. It was a bipartisan recommendation, a very strong report with a lot of input from a lot of good members of Parliament from right across the divide and right across the political spectrum. So I think we've got good hope to believe that if we keep plugging away, we will actually not just catch up with other jurisdictions on this, but actually can lead the way internationally on some of these sorts of issues. So it's a long road, but I believe that we are making some traction, and we'll see hopefully within the next few weeks whether that's really the case or not.
A quick one.
Hi, I'm KJ. I'm actually interested in the corruption perception index. That seems quite subjective, that language. So I'm wondering what measures are used to inform it.
So the Corruption Perceptions Index has been running for a long time. It's a composite index of up to 12 or 13 different surveys that are conducted around the world. In Australia's case, there's 9 different surveys which are combined to all standardised to dictate where we sit. The surveys there are a range of surveys. Many of them are conducted amongst expert groups, business groups, people who, there's a World Bank survey that's part of it. There's a whole string of pretty well-established and well-respected surveys that make it up, and then it's a composite index that's put together to give maximum coverage across the maximum number of countries in the world, because many of these surveys cover some countries but not others, and that was the original idea of the CPI. It's Corruption Perception Index because it's basically asking mostly experts or people who are in a position to observe the situation in other countries or across a range of countries to indicate what level of corruption they think there is and where it is and how bad it is and whether it's getting worse or not. And then it's all aggregated into an overall rating and score. So once you break it down, there are interesting patterns which people do contest and say, oh, well, that shows that, that's not, there's other sides to the story of what's happening. But the whole idea is that it's an aggregate indicator of just how things are travelling, and that's how it's used. The main thing is that the correlations between what the CPI shows and everything else, every other survey, the World Bank's independent control of corruption indexes, the correlation is extremely strong. So there's not much debate now about the reliability of the CPI as a sort of indicator of corruption perception. The main thing is that it doesn't measure corruption experience. The Global Corruption Barometer surveys do that, other surveys do that. There are other mechanisms for trying to do that. It's very difficult. But what we've generally found over a long period of time is that perception measured this way is a pretty good, accurate indicator of what's going on. So it's always worth scrutiny and analysis and unpacking. But at least for the last 5 years, I think Transparency International is pretty confident that the CPI is playing a pretty useful role in giving that overall picture of what's happening.
Thank you. I'd like to now hand over to Professor Haig Patapan, Director of the Centre of Governance and Public Policy, for a vote of thanks.
Hi everyone. It's my privilege and pleasure to give the vote of thanks for tonight's presentation. Firstly, AJ, I wanted to thank you for showing us what a scholar looks like. we often hear about engaged scholarship, but we don't see what that entails. Certain universities talk about university of the real world, which involves people traveling around and having holidays and doing those things. But you've demonstrated, I think, what it takes to be an engaged scholar, someone who has put in many long hours doing research, doing interviews, translating that into actually substantial insights that will make a difference for Australian politics. And that surely is a major contribution, so thank you for that. I also want to thank you for your generosity. It's not often that professors are generous to their colleagues, but in your case, you're not just generous to your colleagues, but you're generous to your doctoral students. I suppose they're the future AJs we're populating, but you're demonstrating the art of the good scholar in showing that not only do you do excellent research, but you provide for the future with example as well as your scholarship. Now, the third thing I want to thank you for, it always is three, of course, is all the questions you provoked in my mind. And I have a list of them here. But relax, everyone, I won't go through all of them. And some of them have already been mentioned. The first one that caught my attention was how reliable are impressions. You know how terrified people get flying on planes because they think something bad will happen. And it doesn't help if you persuade them that it's safer than driving a car and so on. So how reliable are these perceptions of corruption and all those other related evaluations? Aren't they really capturing other phenomena as well? And I'm now thinking of the anti-politics sentiment that seems to be dominating the world. Anti-politician, anti-politics. I know you tried to disaggregate the confidence from the others, but that was certainly one of them. And the other one I thought was the extent to which institutions become your focus, and in becoming a focus you seem to perhaps not completely neglect, but not pay as much attention to the role of individuals within institutions. So institutions matter as much as individuals that run and organize them. And yet you seem to have a very bleak view of these individuals. You're saying everyone is in it for their money, or whatever. So it's great having a new car that is beautiful and shiny, but if it's going to be driven by crooks, what is the point? And finally, it struck me that having seen your Greek temple and then your PowerPoint that followed with all the clouds and the question mark, the question that came to my mind was, do we really need another institution? Is this going to make any difference? Surely it's just going to add another straw to the camel's back and break it. In any case, you don't have to answer. You don't have to answer any of these things. I just want to say it's a sign of a great presentation and a good scholar that you prompt these sorts of puzzles and questions. So thank you for the third time for that. It's now my pleasure to, on behalf of Robin and AJ and myself, to invite you for refreshments outside. It will be, I think, in the art gallery, which is just down there. On the way to the art gallery, you'll find a stand where we celebrate the achievements of the Centre for Governance and Public Policy scholars. We thought we didn't have many books this year, but it turns out that Centre members have published 10 books, and they range all the way from the Philosopher Princess from Bohemia to the book of the week for a book on the art of the Prime Minister, or the Prime Minister's craft by Professor Weller. Perhaps a book that people in Canberra should read, as you suggested. I think if this goes through, we'll have, is it 7 in 11 years, perhaps? Something like that. Which may be a good thing, according to you. In any case, while you're making your way there, please enjoy also the exhibition in the museum, which I will just read the title of. It's called Dark Rooms, Women Directing the Lens, 1978 to 98. So this completes the formal part of tonight's proceedings. Thank you.